Good afternoon. My name is Gillian Balaban and I'm Senior Coordinator Governance Relations at GRI. Welcome to this meeting of the Global Sustainability Standards Board, known by its acronym the GSSB, held on 14 September 2023. This virtual meeting is being hosted from Amsterdam, the Netherlands. Please note that all public GSSB meetings are being recorded, and you can find the audio recording on the GSSB webpage, along with high-level summaries of previous GSSB meetings. Present from the GRI Secretariat today are Bastien Buck, Chief of Standards, Claire Dugan, Senior Manager Standards, Elodie Cheney, Senior Manager Standards, Matthew Dunn, Manager Standards, Nora Puro, Senior Manager Standards, and Miguel Perez Ludena, Research Lead. We will now start with a roll call. Anna Nefedova.
Present.
Corley LaRue.
Present.
Chalandra De Silva.
Present.
Galia Tsankova.
Present.
Julia Genuardi.
Present.
Thank you. Jeff Robertson.
Present.
Jennifer Prinsing.
Present.
Peter Colley.
Present.
Vincent Kong.
Present.
Thank you. And GSSP Chair Carol Adams.
Present.
Thank you, everyone. GSSB members Joseph Martin, Deborah Ing, and Ganga Charan Sharma will join shortly. And GSSB members Kim Schumacher and Lara Dana sent their apologies. I will now hand over to the Chair, Carol Adams, to open this meeting.
Thank you very much, Gillian, and welcome to everybody. Nice to see you all again, and very nice to see the Standards Division in the room there in Amsterdam. Welcome to you all. So the first item on our agenda is to approve the draft summary of our previous meeting. Are there any issues anybody wants to raise with that summary? Thank you. So hearing none and seeing heads shaking, I'll take those as agreed and move on to the update from the Standards Division and hand over to Bastien Buck and Claire Dugan. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, and welcome also to the meeting from me here in Amsterdam. I'm joined by very many of the colleagues of the Standards Division in the same location. That's fairly unusual for our proceedings, but that is also the only point of update that I want to bring to this meeting. We're actually succeeding finally for the most part in our recruitment efforts, and we're adding very significant numbers of new colleagues to the Standards Division. We will be close to 40 actually, if all goes well, within the next weeks. While we have some challenges still for individual positions, for the most part, we're realizing the ambition that we've outlined in the work program and then subsequently in the budgeting process of last year, where we're trying to underpin the ambition that the GSB has set for us with the right staffing. And it is a very positive experience that I can report back on in terms of having all these colleagues now joining in bringing their backgrounds and competencies to our joint work here. So I'm very pleased to report that we kicked off our planning process and for the coming year was a meeting of the Standards Division staff in Amsterdam, and we'll build from there. And I think today's call is yet again an example for what all this resource and knowledge competency can actually enable us to do. We have very many different items that we're moving with this call, and this is our joint future, and we will be able to do a lot more with the help of all the new colleagues. For the update of the standards division, we have one specific item that requires your attention now that Claire will introduce. It is related to the Financial Services Technical Committee discussions, and I hand over to Claire for that.
Thanks, Bastian. Hello, Carol. Hello, members of the GSSB. Just a very small adjustment that I'm bringing to your consideration today. That is an addition of one more expert to be nominated to the Capital Markets Technical Committee. Just to quickly recap, in the July GSSB meeting, there was approval of the 3 multi-stakeholder technical committees for the financial services project, one for banking, one for insurance, and one for capital markets. This particular expert, I was in discussion with them during July, and it just took longer than expected to get the employer's approval to take part in the project. So I'm bringing them to your consideration today. And beyond this addition, we do not plan or foresee any further additions at this point. Next slide, please, Jill. So the expert that we're nominating today, they would represent the business constituency. The candidate is from Europe and has worked many years with pension funds. In the last few years has been working with ABP, so this is one of the top 10 pension funds in the world by size. So also this unique position of long-term investor, universal asset owner, which I think brings a unique and really important perspective to the capital markets discussions. So that actually summarizes what I'm bringing to the GSSB today, and I'll hand it back to you, Carol.
Thank you very much, Claire. Jeff, you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Carol. Yeah, thanks. Just had a quick question, Claire. I noticed that for this candidate, the extract didn't touch on any sustainability or ESG kind of related experience. Do they have that and it's just not in the extract? Or what's the story there, please?
Exactly. So there's a couple dimensions there. They were actually, I believe, involved in a peer review process for the GRI tax standard. So they have familiarity with sustainable development in terms of sustainability reporting. And I think beyond that, they're able to leverage the quite good work that this particular employer, where they're currently at, this particular pension fund, is doing in the area of sustainability as a long-term institutional investor. So I think they do bring that perspective, and also just that decades of experience with pension funds in and of itself, I think is really important to bring as well.
Okay, great. And I guess the corollary to that for me then would be, I assume with the other folks from the business enterprise constituency that you feel quite confident that as a whole they have strong expertise on the ESG and sustainability reporting side?
The other 3 are primarily all chief sustainability officers or some kind of iteration of that position. So I think as a group, the 4 candidates bring enough of that perspective, along with, of course, all the other members of the technical committee.
Perfect. Yeah, makes sense. Just wanted to confirm. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Jen.
Thank you very much for that question, and thank you, Claire. Very important that members have experience and knowledge of sustainability, and that we're including one of our key stakeholders, capital markets. And I see from the slide there that we've got a good representation across all our stakeholder constituencies. So thank you for that. Can I ask if we can approve this additional member? Seeing no dissent and nods in favour, we'll take that as approved. Thank you very much, Claire. And that then takes us on to the topic standard for economic performance, which Matthew Dunn is presenting. And I see, Matthew, you've been allocated 10 minutes for this. So efficiency is in order, because as Bastian said, we have a lot of work to get through and a very full agenda.
Thanks, Carol, noted, and good day to you and the GSSB members, and I've already greeted my colleagues today. So, as you said, the objective for my portion of today's discussion is really just to provide the GSSB members with a very brief update of the work we've been doing since the draft proposal for the project was approved in June, and then also to get the approval for us to commence with the project formally, pending your agreement on project proposal. So we can move to the next slide, please, Jill. So here I just wanted to very quickly give you an overview of some of the key updates. As I mentioned, since we last engaged in June, I think firstly, just to note that following the approval process from our June session, the draft proposal was shared with the GRI board and stakeholder council, and we didn't receive any feedback from them. So there were several emails that were received from the GRI board and stakeholder council noting their interest and support of the project proposal, but beyond that, there wasn't anything tangible to add to our draft proposal. The next thing is just to note that there have been some minor changes made to the draft proposal you received in June, which really just aim to reflect, the inputs that we uncovered from our own research and also through stakeholder engagement in the interim. So I think the first thing to note is that we have made some changes to the timeline we proposed in June around our working group recruitment phase, which is pending the approval of this project, scheduled to kick off from next week. So really, this was just extended by a month in order to ensure that we gave enough time for nominations to be made around experts looking to join our working group, and also that we had enough time in order to interview interested parties. So really just to ensure that we were able to source the right people for the working group. Our intention then is to present a final list of working group members or nominees to the GSSB in December for your approval, and pending that, to convene the working group in the start of February next year. I think also just to build on what Bastian mentioned earlier is that since we submitted the draft in June, we have brought additional resource capacity online, which is dedicated to the economic impact project in the form of a senior standards officer, as well as an additional resource to contribute to our research activities. So that's going to be really useful once we pick up the project. I think those were the key things I wanted to mention in terms of updates, which is relevant for today's discussion. So we can move on to the next slide, please, Jill. So again, here it's just to recap the objective of the project, and I think nothing's really changed from what we presented to the GSSB before, but just to again highlight why we're doing this and the importance that we see in this project, both for GRI and also for organizations and reporters looking to use our standards. So we can move on to the next slide, please, Joe. Again, just to remind the GSSB how we're approaching this is a programmatic approach. So we will be touching on different key themes at different stages over the next 3 years, 36 months or so. Keeping in mind it is quite a broad portfolio of work, so it will take some time. And the reason that we've done this is in order to ensure that we manage internally our own resource capacity, but also are able to dedicate enough time and space with our experts to properly engage in these respective themes and integrate the most relevant best practice and authoritative instruments and sources into our economic standards. We can move on to the next slide, please, Joel. So here you have seen in the project proposal is just a high-level overview of the proposed timeline. You'll see the changes that I mentioned in terms of the working group recruitment are very minor. But beyond that, I think just key to note is that pending approval from the GSSB, we intend to formally kick off this project early next week. So we will start with phase 1 of this project, looking at distributed value or economic performance, as well as impacts on institution, which will kick off in quarter 2 of next year. As I mentioned, the working group 1 candidates are expected to be presented to the GSSB in December. and then we will convene our first working group session in February next year, 2024. So we can move into the next slide, please, Jill. So I think that was the main update I wanted to provide, Jill. If there are any questions from the GSSB, here's an opportunity to please feel free to ask them. Otherwise, I'll just leave the question of the approval of the proposal open to the group. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, Matthew. And when I was looking through this, when we're talking about goods and services, I was thinking about the provision of services by public sector organisations as well here, and say in education and health and their relevance to the economy and people's overall well-being. And so hopefully through our collaboration with GSSB, we'll have some appropriate public sector representation on this as it progresses. Did anybody have any issues they wanted to raise with this project proposal? Any questions of Matthew? Chalendra?
Matthew, just to check with you on, you have said out of that climate change is out of scope from from these standards. How will that relate to the financial disclosures or the project proposal you're talking about, the economic impact part, when the climate change, along with how will those two get aligned is probably my question, Matthew?
Fortunately, how will the current climate change disclosure be addressed or updated, and how this
yes, how will it tie up with the project proposal for economic impact?
Yeah. So having gone through our existing disclosures, we discussed internally where that particular disclosure should fit. So currently, it's being addressed by my colleague Margarita Barbieri, who is devising our climate standard. So she's engaging with this particular disclosure within the work that she's doing. So once she's completed that, then we'll look to align as best as possible with the work that she's done in those standards.
Okay. Thanks, Matthew.
Carol, I saw you speaking there, but you're on mute, by the way.
Thank you. Peter Colley? Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you. I've basically noticed in the project proposal that the time frame seems to have become longer than was originally envisaged. Could that be explained? And as part of that, I noticed that there's 3 phases and 2 working groups. So could that be explained, please?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, sure. So I think, as mentioned, the first part where that would have contributed to the extension of the time frame is in this working group recruitment phase. I think just from engaging with colleagues internally who've had experience with recruiting working group members, it was advised that we extend that slightly, particularly given this topic, as it's not yet clear the type of or the appetite or the type of engagement that we would receive around working group nominations. So to ensure that we give ourselves the best possibility of finding the right people, that was extended as well. And then around, I think you may be mentioning or may have seen, particularly around phase 2, the reason that was extended is because we see the 3 standards which inform impacts on institutions, so anti-corruption, anti-competitive behavior, and public policy, as potentially remaining standalone standards, so separate standards. And it's, I mean, speaking to stakeholders, there seems potential to be quite a bit of work, so for example, in the anti-corruption space, that would need to be done. So it's just to try and give ourselves again enough space to incorporate those changes and that feedback. In terms of the working group logic, so firstly, it was driven by the length of the program, so around engagement. Our thinking was that we wanted to ensure that the working groups that we assembled had enough capacity and time to be engaged fully for the period that they were involved. And across 36 months that we felt that was too long. So there's one aspect of it, which is why we are doing two working groups. The next aspect is that we wanted to try and ensure that we could cover topics or themes with overlaps or intersections through one working group. So where we were able to share knowledge and insights across the working group members that we assembled for phase one, for instance. And then potentially realize some efficiency gains in that. So the risk of assembling 3 working groups, for instance, is also that it would add additional time to the project. So that was also part of the thinking in terms of the separate working groups.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Peter and Matthew. Are there any other comments or questions? Okay, can I ask if we can approve this project proposal, please? Okay, thank you. Seeing nods and no dissensions, we'll move on to the next item, taking that as approved. Thank you. So over to Miguel now on the alignment of sector standards with new topic standards.
Thank you, Carol, and good afternoon from Amsterdam. Yes, I will present to you this project proposal, which is item 4 in your documentation, on the alignment of the topic and sector standards. On the first slide, we can see the problem statement, basically, which is a potential misalignment between topic and sector standards. As you know, the GRI sector standards list the relevant disclosures for each material topic, and most of them come from topic standards. In fact, in the slide, I have put there a copy of the current state of the reporting on biodiversity for GRI 11, oil and gas. And you can see there that the disclosures 304 1 and 304.2 come 306 1 and 306 to come from the current standard on biodiversity, and that is typical of the sector standards. That is how most cases operate. So of course, when a topic standard is revised, the reporters can be directed to different disclosures, depending on whether they are looking at the topic standard or at the sector standard. And that is a misalignment that we should try to prevent. Of course, it is the coming approval of the biodiversity topic standard that should trigger action now. This doesn't mean that it's the first time that you are seeing this problem or discussing it. Actually, in the work program 23-25, this has been highlighted already as a priority issue, that we need to schedule a project to preserve the linkage between topic and sector standards. In the long run, the solution that is proposed by the standards division is to include in every new topic standard project an activity that will incorporate the alignment of whatever comes from the new project with the sector standards. But this has not been the case for the current topic standards, for the current projects and topic standards that are alive now, namely the biodiversity, the climate change, the labor-related topics, and even the economic impacts, which have just been approved. These projects have not such a provision, and therefore we need to put in front of you this proposal. On the next slide, we can see if we can move the slide, please. Yes. The proposal has as an objective to align the existing portfolio of GRI sector standards with any new and revised topic standards. And the important thing here is that the scope of the project in terms of the standard is the four existing projects that have been approved and that are developing new standards or about to develop them, namely again biodiversity, climate change, labor-related topics, and economic impacts. Of course, you know that some of these projects are actually programmatic and they cover quite a substantive number of standards, so they can be quite long in duration. And the project that we are proposing for you now to approve will mimic that duration, meaning that this project will actually shadow those four projects and will only conclude after those four projects have finally wrapped up. So it will be a long project with many activities that we cannot completely foresee now, but we should focus now on the first one in front of us, that we are taking it as a pilot activity, which is aligning GRI 11, GRI 12, and GRI 13, which are the existing sector standards, with the revised topic standard for biodiversity. And this is the activity that we have in front of us, that is well defined, and that we are using to determine the methodology that we will apply for aligning sector standards with new and revised topic standards. There are three important criteria for this methodology. Of course, one is that it has to adhere to the due process protocol, that goes without saying. The second one is that it has to be scalable, because while the pilot activity will be aligning 3 sector standards with 1 revised topic standard, in the future, as there will be more living sector standards and as we increase the speed that we revise topic standards, these can easily multiply by several times, and therefore any methodology that we define to do this alignment has to be simple enough so that it can be undertaken within the resources of the standards division. And finally, it has to be agile, because normally there is a year or little more than a year of time between the approval of a new standard and its adoption date. And it is within that window of time that the topic standards need to be aligned, so that when the new topic standard is finally being used, all the sector standards are also in line with it. The timeline that we are proposing to you in the project proposal, therefore, it limits itself only to the pilot activity of aligning the existing sector standards with biodiversity. And basically it is a concentrated copy of what other projects have. It has basically the same procedures, but in a much more compressed time, understanding that the content development will be much more limited, and therefore all the other procedures will be simpler and more agile. It is the intention of the standards division to minimize the changes into the sector standards while maintaining the linkage with the revised topic standards. And I will leave it at this. I'll hand it over to Carol now for any questions or comments before we move on.
Thank you very much, Miguel. A nice, clear paper and presentation. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Jeff?
Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Miguel. One question that I had in reviewing the item paper there was, I believe there was a discussion of, whether or not the change is considered significant. And that makes sense to me. I think for some insignificant changes, obviously it should be just a formality and something we can get out quickly. Is there any guidance or description of how we determine what's significant and what's not? Is it sort of subjective and determined through collaboration of, the standards division and the GSSB?
Yes, indeed, it is, of course, the GSSB to determine what is significant and what is not. There is no specific threshold that we can say here, but of course any changes will have to be proposed to you for approval, and you are indeed the ultimate decision maker on whether a change is significant and therefore needs further revision, further consultation before it's approved.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff and Miguel. Peter Colley.
Thank you. Two quick questions. With respect to the due process protocol, I haven't got it in front of me, but could you confirm that we don't need to have a technical committee or a project working group to do these small revisions to the sector standards, that we can still meet the due process protocol without them? And the second question is, it's just about numbering. I presume that even if the changes to the sector standards are relatively minor, there'll still be an issue about users needing to know that they've got the most recent version and not a version that's a year or two out of date. I presume you have been thinking about some slight modification to the numbering system, whereby a sector standard becomes, rather than number 11, it becomes number 11.1 or something. So I presume you are contemplating that's an issue in this project. Thank you.
Just on the first, in relation to the due process, so it is the prerogative of the GSB to decide whether a particular project requires a technical committee or working group. In principle, you can decide to run projects without external expertise involved in form of a technical committee and working group. And we have one example for that, at least in part, the update of the universal standards was performed in that way. I think part of what we're saying here is also we will look to how practical that is in terms of what we're encountering. What we know for this initial phase, we believe we are so close to having updated the biodiversity standard and also still very much, I think, on top of the sector-related standards that form part of this initial project, that we can probably scale that without having that mechanism in place. But what we would like right now, it could very well be that we arrive at a point where we need to think about a structure like this in addition. The second point I will leave to Miguel for the numbering.
Yes, thank you. We have not come to a complete conclusion on how we would present the aligned versions of the sector standards, and we welcome any suggestions by the GSSB, but we don't expect to change the coding of it, meaning that GRI 11 oil and gas will continue to be GRI 11 oil and gas, because it will be just a version of the standard that is aligned with a new topic standard on biodiversity. It would change likely the year in which it is approved. That is a proposal for a compromise in the branding of the standard, to recognize the continuity of it. It's not a completely revised sector standard, but also recognize that it's a slightly updated version.
Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any other questions? Okay, that was a good discussion. Thank you. If we could move on to the next slide. Thank you. So the question is, do we approve the project proposal here for the alignment of sector standards with new and revised topic standards? And seeing nods in favour and none against, we'll take that as approved. Thank you all, and thanks to Miguel. And so the next item is the sector standard project for mining, for the mining sector, and an update on the public comment feedback, which Nura is giving us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carol, and good afternoon on my part as well from Amsterdam. It's been a while since we've given an update, so it's good to have this opportunity to outline a little bit of the feedback that we received, and also hear your thoughts on the way to move forward. So, as you might remember, the public comment period for mining took place from early February this year until end of May. And the responses have been analyzed and processed in full, and also available on the GRI website for the public. And I want to start by saying that the response was overall very positive, both through our direct public engagements as well as through the submissions. And before talking about the specific feedback points, I would like to first say a couple of things about how we engage the audiences. So we can move on to the next slide, please, Jill. So we worked together with the communications team of GRI to develop a wide-ranging communications campaign, which resulted in good coverage of the project in several industry publications and in our own channels, of course. And with the support of the GRI events team, we carried out 2 successful global webinars, and in collaboration with the GRI regional networks, also organized tailored workshops and briefings focusing on the key regions that we had identified for the mining sector. And these were South Africa, Latin America, Brazil, Southeast Asia, and India. And many of these were fully delivered in local language or accompanied with simultaneous translation. There was also good interest from industry associations. We gave 5 briefings in total about the standard for relevant organizations in Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Guatemala, and North America. And the team was also present in 5 mining specific conferences to spread the word and engage both reporters and information users about the upcoming standard. And in total, the GRI-led and partner events were attended by more than 1,100 people, with many more engaged in person in the field. We can move on to the next slide. Just a quick reminder of the public comment questions. What was our focus? We wanted to gather feedback not only on the scope, clarity, and feasibility of the standard, but also specifically about mine site reporting, which features quite strongly in the exposure draft. We also posed questions on specific topics, namely those that are not covered by the GRI topic standards or that are very important for the sector. And these included closure and rehabilitation, tailings, artisanal and small-scale mining, conflict affected and high-risk areas, as well as community impacts, which include issues like resettlement, currently not covered. And then we can move on to the next slide and the response. So we were very pleased to see both reporters and information users activated by this public comment. We received over 90 formal submissions. So it's very apparent that this sector is under a magnifying glass, with many interested in ensuring that the sector is governed well and the impacts are being managed. Half of the respondents identified as information users, a little less than a third as reporters, and 22% as other. So these would be organizations, institutions like think tanks, lawyers, academic institutions, governments, as well as industry associations. We also had a third of the respondents who had specific expertise in quarrying, so we received a good number of feedback on the appropriateness of including quarrying in the scope. On the regional representation, on the next slide, It was also encouraging to see a lot of interest across regions, with Latin America, Europe, and Asia coming at the top, all of these providing a bit more or a bit less than 20 submissions each. Around 10 responses came from Oceania, Africa, and North America each. And some organizations were also categorized as global. So these may be international or multilateral organizations such as the ILO or membership organizations who have members across the world. And this response also speaks to the public comment efforts undertaken by the team and the wider GRI team as we delivered bespoke engagements in all of these regions, and seems to have paid off. Going into the contents of the public comment response. So this slide is a lot of text, you don't have to read it all. It summarizes some of the more general or cross-cutting feedback that we received to the standard. So first of all, the scope was mostly seen as clear and practical, with most supporting the inclusion of quarrying in the standard. A few questions were posed about the approach on ASM, how these operators are included, so that will be clarified, and the applicability to organizations who are only involved with exploring, for example. As comments related to materiality and the reporting model included requests to clarify the difference between levels of reporting in the standard, as well as more guidance for determining the most important topics and disclosures. Many business organizations were concerned about the amount of reporting, the quantity being considered as too much and too granular. Some of them also had additional concerns about the obligation to offer an explanation in the content index whenever a topic or a disclosure was not determined as material by the organization. On the other side of the spectrum, information users, some information users expressed concern about the additional sector reporting not being mandatory, and this was seen as particularly problematic for topics that do not have a topic standard, that are not covered by an existing GRI topic standard, keeping in mind that some of these topics will likely never be covered by a topic standard due to their specificity to a specific sector. So, for example, tailors would be one example. On alignment, efforts to align with other relevant standards was, as expected, a key concern, especially for mining organizations, ISSB in particular, but also industry-specific initiatives such as Towards Sustainable Mining was mentioned. And gender was also a cross-cutting issue. These aspects received a lot of feedback, though from a limited number of organizations, mostly in the civil society sphere. Then the next slide focuses on feedback on mine site reporting. So this was a very important cross-cutting issue and generated a lot of feedback as well, which was prompted by the questionnaire. And as mentioned, the draft included a large number of reporting recommendations to disaggregate the data by mine site. And this type of reporting has been identified as crucial to understanding mining organizations and the specific mine's impacts on the surrounding communities, which can of course be very significant, and how these are addressed. And just to remind that when listed as an additional sector-specific reporting expectation, mine site reporting is technically not required reporting. However, many reporting organizations also feel that once something is codified in a GRI standard, they feel the obligation to report it, which is of course good news for us. But again, here the reporter views and the information user views were quite opposed. So reporters cited reasons such as reports becoming even lengthier than they are now, the cost of compliance with the standards becoming too high, and in a small number of cases, business sensitivity of certain data, which seems to be maybe more of a geographical issue than a cross-cutting industry limitation. Whereas information users were close to unanimous of the usefulness and criticality of MySite data, and it was seen as difficult or impossible to discern impacts and risks from information reported on a corporate level. There was also a perceived inequality or expectations for companies operating in more strict jurisdictions that already require more disaggregated reporting. So it was seen as perhaps leveling the playing field. A little bit of statistics next on which topics were most reported. The new topics are taking the lead here. So new topics meaning not covered by the GRI system yet. So artisanal small-scale mining, closure and rehabilitation. GHG emissions comes up very high because we also asked a question in the public consultation questionnaire about scope 3 emissions. So this generated a lot of responses. Tailings is there, as well as conflict affected and high-risk areas. And after that, the community and environmental focused topics were most commented. And in total, the team processed around 1,100 individual comments. But as a result of comments to the topics, no new topics will be proposed to be included in the future mining standard, nor is it suggested to remove any of the existing 25 that were already included in the exposure draft. The next slide, you see a little bit about the type of comments received. So of these 1,100 comments, almost a quarter of them were proposals for new disclosures. And from the new disclosures proposed, about 10% were on local communities and closure, followed by conflict-affected high-risk areas, security providers, and ASM. So everything very much closely connected to the impacts relevant for communities and people. Proponents of these new disclosures came mostly from the mediating institution constituency, the consultants, academia, but also quite strongly from investors, followed by civil society. So this was somewhat a surprising metric. And also 26 new disclosures were proposed by business organizations. And after analyzing the comments, the most significant changes in terms of reporting are proposed for tailings, with some new recommendations, closure and rehabilitation, land and resource rights, specifically their settlement aspect, is being reinforced with IFC-aligned disclosures. There are also additions to artisanal small-scale mining topic, as well as conflict-affected and high-risk areas. In addition, gender aspects are being incorporated into a number of topics. Apologies. On the next slide, we just have a few nice photos of our in-person meeting. So we invited our working group to go through all the public feedback with us and determine the next steps for revisions. We had 14 out of our 20 working group members in Amsterdam for 2 days. And this gave us a great indication of the way forward. We've since had a couple of follow-up calls and been implementing revisions, gearing up for the next major review of the draft. So I have one final slide outlining the next steps. So as mentioned, we have all but finished with the revisions from the public comment. The working group is receiving the next draft in the next couple of days, and the last reviews and revisions will take place in October and early November, we hope, with submission of the final draft to the GSSB expected in November, hoping to get approval in December. I see a hand.
Yeah, if I could just thank you for that that presentation, and very interesting to see that investors, not surprising to me, but very interesting to see that investors are asking for the impact reporting, and that the respondents to the you know, the survey, the respondents are noting the link between impacts and risks. Also, great to see the number of responses that you have there, the geographical spread of those responses, and the thoughtfulness, and of course all the volunteers in the room working. So you know, that reminder that we have these expert volunteers involved in this. So just my observations there, and I'll pass to Corley, who perhaps has a question.
Yes, thank you, Carol. I mean, just to echo your thoughts, it's wonderful to see the level of response, and also well done to the team for working through a, you know, quite a daunting set of comments. My observation, you mentioned quite a couple of times, you know, that on the reporters' side there's concern about burden of reporting and you know, granularity, level of granularity, and so on, balanced with the users saying that they actually want to see the granularity and the more reporting. Is there a way to, I mean, how do you balance that firstly in actually incorporating the feedback into the draft, you know, to alleviate the concerns about burdensome reporting, but balancing that with the demand, and then in rolling out the standard, is there a way to, you know, make that message reach the users as well, to say, you know, the burden is somewhat warranted by the fact that there is a need and a demand for this level of reporting, because I think that's an interesting dynamic that one should leverage.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. So it's been probably the biggest dilemma that we've faced in this project, and so, well, first of all, how to alleviate the concerns. Well, first of all, is maybe there's a role that we can play in providing some additional tools for companies to help them present data. For example, when we think about companies in the mining sector, if you have a quantitative metric, you know that the figures come from somewhere, and the figures most likely come from the mine sites themselves. So most of this data is actually, it exists already. It is not necessarily reported externally due to concerns, for example, of sustainability reports becoming not 200 pages, but 500 or 700 or 1,000 pages. But we have seen many good examples of reporters presenting data in smart ways, for example, in Excel spreadsheets for mine sites, say water data being provided in a very succinct manner. So there are ways to alleviate that. It is still a dialogue that we are having with especially the business constituency. The other stakeholders don't need convincing for the mine site data. And I believe that one of the stakeholder groups that we can use quite effectively here are the investors, because investors are most often these stakeholders that can have a big say, a big influence in what becomes reported publicly. And when investors say that this is the level of data that we need to see, it often is accepted by reporters. So maybe there's a partnership communications efforts that we can also do in that front. In terms of rolling out, making the message public that there's a need for this, there's a lot of research, there's a lot of authoritative organizations that have made this claim, and academia works as well. So that part we have covered, that it's not GRI who's saying that this is needed, but we are being told by the external stakeholders that it's what our standards should also reflect.
Thank you, Nora. Peter?
Hello, yeah, thank you. Look, I had to step out for a minute then due to a family issue, but so I hope I'm not repeating what Corley's asked and what's been responded to. But yeah, on the issue of site-specific data and the reporting burden, it's interesting to look at the Responsible Mining Initiative, which the Standards Division may well have done. The Responsible Mining Initiative has closed now, but in their exercise over a number of years, they looked at company level data to start with, but then they sought site-specific data, and what they found was that companies were either unable or unwilling to provide the site level data, which sort of did cause concern about where the company level data was coming from if they were unable to provide the site level data. So yes, I think there is quite a bit of report user demand for site level data, and there are innovative ways of presenting the data, and we need to overcome industry resistance to providing site level data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Any other questions or comments? If we could go to the next slide, please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for that presentation. Very thorough, very interesting. Thank you. We now move on to feedback on the biodiversity exposure draft with Elodie. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Carol, and hello again to all GSSB members. And today I will also give an update on the public comment feedback that we received this time for the exposure draft of the revised biodiversity standard. So you may recall that in March we provided an initial update on the outcome of the public comment activities, and in particular in terms of the profile of the respondents, which is what we had time to look at the time. And today we'll go in more detail into the feedback, the elements or areas, issues that were raised during the consultation, which are now informing the finalization of the standards. So if we move to the next slide, you will see this is the wrong slide, that's the wrong project, but if we look at the timeline of the, for the biodiversity revision, since we last presented in March, the technical committee met on 3 occasions between April and May to discuss the public feedback itself, give directions on how to address that feedback. And they also met in June to discuss the first set of revisions, and we have 2 final meetings planned, one next week and one in November, to finalize the standard. So it's the expectation to submit the final draft to the GSSB for approval at the end of the year, with the publication and launch early next year. So the next slide. So here you saw, so that's an update on what we presented in March. So that's we now have the final number of submissions, public submissions, as we were still tracking some respondents as to whether they wanted to have their submissions published or not at the time. So we have 122 formal, so public submissions that we received, and a few more, 11 respondents that decided not to publish their feedback. So we cannot count them as formal submissions. So we're still looking at the feedback that they provided. And the survey, the online survey, was the main tool to provide feedback. And then on the next slide, you will see a breakdown by constituencies for the public submissions. So again, similar to what you saw in March, it's mostly the business enterprises, mediating institutions, and civil society organizations that provided feedback. And on the next slide, you'll see an updated breakdown by region. And here again, no surprise, very similar. It's mostly European organizations or respondents, followed by North America, Latin America, and Asia. So if we move to the next slide, you see here we start looking more at the content or what people have told us. The survey contained questions for each proposed disclosure, asking for the clarity of the content that was proposed and the feasibility of reporting that content. We also had overarching questions that were specific to asking about reporting information on the supply chain, about site level reporting, the connection between the disclosures and if that was clear, and the alignment with TNFD. So we received a lot of feedback specific to the content in each disclosure, and we also saw some feedback that are really covering or that are cover cross-cutting themes throughout the standards. So that's the one you saw on the slide. The three main themes that were raised covered first the concept of most significant impact. So the use of the term, there seems to be lack of clarity around the term, how organizations are meant to identify those most significant impact. And some as well raise the concern that there may be a risk that it will lead to less comparability across organizations, as they are the ones who decide on the threshold or the prioritization process. We also received a lot of feedback on the challenges with reporting information on the supply chain, mostly because we had a dedicated question for that, but that also came to the fore in when people commented on the disclosures themselves. And it has to do mostly with the difficulty to report information beyond the first year. And there's also a lot of people asking for more guidance on how to prioritize impacts. Lastly, an issue that was less anticipated was we also got feedback on the link between the activities of the organization and the impact on biodiversity and how that was presented in our exposure draft. So that's mostly pertinent for the two disclosure on the direct drivers of biodiversity loss and changes to the state of biodiversity. So there were concerns on establishing a causal link between the activities of the organization and the direct drivers. We had, for instance, waste mentioned as a possible source of pollution, which is not always the case if waste is handled properly. So there was a lot of questions around those linkages and how they were presented in our standard. Also, when looking at the state of biodiversity, another element is that companies are operating in areas where there are many other actors that are also impacted by biodiversity. So those impacts are often cumulative impacts, and attributing a specific change in the state of biodiversity to a single organization is extremely complicated. So here as well, we also have to clarify the framing of that disclosure. That's it. So that was questions. You will see as well on the slide I've indicated for you the breakdown of respondent by constituency to give you an idea of who provided that feedback. I won't go into too much details for the sake of time, but you can see quite often business enterprises and mediating institutions tend to be the one who raised those concerns the most often. On the next slide, so then we'll start diving into each disclosure. You'll see, so on the slide, first of all, that the number of respondents who commented on the disclosure itself, as well as the number of comments received. So every time there were 2 questions for each disclosure, and each response were analyzed and broken down into separate comment for each issue raised for response. So that's the number you see when we talk about comments received. And also, I mean, the stats are here to give you an idea of who responded, but it's also good to know that in some instances we also had respondents that were typically membership organizations who collated feedback from several of their members, so sometimes in an integrated fashion, but sometimes they also collated feedback from many organizations, many of their members. So their submission will raise one issue several times, which is something to be aware of when we look at the stats and how one submissions can then have quite a lot of weight when we look at the issues that were raised. So that's in terms of context, but in terms of the area of feedback that we received on that particular disclosure, so that was looking at the location of operational sites with the most significant impact. The two main areas commented relate to the areas of high biodiversity values, comments on the need to define the term. So because we also had quite extensive guidance, a lot of comments on the guidance, on the examples of areas and types of areas that we have listed in there, and the tools as well that we're referencing. So it's also good to know that for that particular area, we know that we worked with TNFD, who had also developed or worked on the classification of categorizations of this area of biodiversity importance in the past few months. So in between the last release of the beta framework and the final framework that will be released next week. So we will also work with them to underline, but also see how that can help us address the feedback that we received. We also received comments through the public consultation on the sensitivity of providing information on location. So both the location, the coordinates of operational sites for the organization, and also some issues around disclosing the location of the suppliers. To move on to the next slides. If we look at the disclosure on the direct drivers of biodiversity loss, 78 respondents provided feedback. So it is a broad disclosure, or the scope of the disclosure is really broad. So we had a lot of varied comments, but the key themes that emerged from the consultation were about the data and tools to identify which drivers to report on, how to measure drivers. Again, a lot of feedback asking for more guidance. And looking at the drivers themselves, so land and sea use change is the one that attracted the most comments, with the issues raised to or feedback asking to include more information on cutoff dates, included as well a modified ecosystem, not just a conversion of natural ecosystems, these kind of things. And we also received several other comments on the other drivers, in particular invasive alien species, greenhouse gas emission and pollution. On the next slide, moving on to the disclosure covering changes to the state of biodiversity. So 76 respondents provided feedback, and the comment focus mainly on the requirement on ecosystem conditions. So that's one that can be again difficult to measure, because there are many ways of measuring ecosystem conditions, and there's still a lot of debate on what is the best practice in that domain. So here again, in a way, we give a lot of, in the exposure draft, freedom to the organization to choose which is the methods that is best, most suitable to them, provided that they explain how they've done it. So there was some comment around that, whether we could, for the sake of consistency, if we could, narrow the scope there. And then in terms of mostly challenges to report information in that disclosure, it was mostly around reporting information on affected species. There's on the supply chain, that's probably one of the disclosures that also attracted a lot of feedback on the supply chain. And then, some comment around the guidance we have on the baseline and how it needs to be defined or, by organization. On the next slide, so then next, the exposure draft cover affected ecosystem services. So we got 64 respondents provided feedback. Less sensitive issues raised here, but again, clarity, the comments ask a clarification on identifying these ecosystem services. So we use the term significant ecosystem services. So then a respondent asked to more information on how to determine that what we mean by significance of ecosystem services. And then you see on the next slide on the disclosure that covers the management of biodiversity-related impacts. Two key areas of comment were around adding information on the restoration and offset steps of the mitigation hierarchy, primarily to assess the credibility of the information reported and the actions taken. So there were a few comments relating to the risk of greenwashing, especially with the offset practices. So that's what comes, the main area of commenting there. And then the following disclosure on the next slide. So, 53 respondents provided feedback on the disclosure that covers the policies and commitments to halt and reverse the loss of biodiversity. And here again, the feedback was mostly in clarity around some of the sources that we used, in part because those were still in development when we released the exposure draft, and also the term science-based, draw a few comments on how to interpret that concept. And finally, there was one disclosure on access and benefit sharing, which was discussed at the July meeting, so it's on the next slide. And that, so I won't go into much detail since this was discussed before this, a few months ago, but as we raised and we received substantive feedback on the fundamental flaws in the exposure draft. So this disclosure was revised and we exposed the second exposure period concluded last Sunday on the 10th of September. And we received 17 submissions. And so we're still going through the details of the submissions, but from what we saw, there's overall support for the proposed changes. So that's, I'll leave it as this. So I don't know how we do with time, but happy to take on some questions if there's any.
Thank you very much, Elodie. Again, very, very comprehensive summary. Thank you. Covering all the points, the geographical areas and the different stakeholder constituencies responding to each bit. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Where can people find this, Elodie, if they want to get this, to see this feedback and the feedback summary? I can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Yeah, so all the submissions are available online. So we've, within a month after the end of the public consultation, we published all the verbatim submissions that we received. So that can be accessible. And again, for the second exposure and access and benefit sharing, we will be publishing these very shortly as well. So it's all publicly available. For the summary,
thank you very much.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know if it's also useful to add that for the summary itself and how we intend to respond to or what are the key areas that have emerged and how we address that, that will be covered in the basis for conclusion that will be released with the final standard as well.
With the standard, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Galia.
Yeah, hello, thank you for this. I just wanted to make a comment because in our organization, in Coca-Cola Hellenic, we started with the 2 steps of the SBTN methodology, plus we were selected as a pilot to test readiness check framework. It is a tool to help companies to be ready for SBTN methodology. So it's a very complicated methodology, but I think that the biggest companies are going to this. So we need to assure more and more alignment with SBTN. It is publicly available. All the steps are publicly available. The targets, they're piloting now. They're tested by 11 organizations as far as I remember. So it's much better to align. There are tools available that are allowed for each of the 5 pressures. So it would be good way to align with this more. If you need more information what we are doing and what are the results of the test, you can send me a personal email.
Extremely interested. Yeah, thank you for that. We use SBTN as an input. I think they released the first few steps of the methodology a couple of months ago. I think it was around May. And as I mentioned earlier, like how to identify, to prioritize those most significant impact was a key area of concern, and that's definitely one source of information that we want to draw on to provide more guidance to reporters. So that's again that we're seeking alignment where we can, and thank you very much for the offer as well.
Okay. Well, there's no more comments. Thank you very much, and we will move on to the next item. And the next item, the paper for this item is a very clear table prepared by the standards division, showing the Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 requirements under GRI 305. And comparing those with IFRS S2. So the purpose was solely to show reporters that are already using GRI 305 where there were similarities and differences to enable them to do the disclosures under IFRS S2. And I'm going to pass over to Laura to speak to that. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Carol, and hello to all GSSB members. So next, we are looking at item 5, which, as Carol mentioned, is a draft comparison of the GHG emissions disclosures in GRI 305, our emissions standard, and IFRS S2, the standard on climate issued by the ISSB. So this comparison is actually the same that we presented to you at the last GSSB meeting on the 20th of July. And as you know, at that meeting, we also had representatives of the ISSB present, and we had an initial discussion with them on that content at that meeting. So since then, we have packaged this in a paper as presented to you today. For further feedback, and we have also extended an invitation to the ISSB to further develop and publish this as a joint document. And as Carol mentioned, the purpose would be to offer a very practical tool for companies that want to use both sets of standards together, particularly GRI reporters who now want to apply IFRS S2, and to highlight the main areas of commonality and complementarity. So currently we're working together with the ISSB to see how we can accomplish this within the next few weeks. And one important thing to note is that this type of publications are subject to the ISSB due process. Which means that this content will have to go through a number of steps and parties within the ISSB structure. From our side, according to our own due process, this type of publications, which compare the GRI standards against other standards, do not need to go through our own due process, because the contents of the GRI standards are not affected by those publications. But we nevertheless would like to invite the feedback of the GSSB on this content. Also, one important thing to note as well is that our own climate standard is changing, it's being revised at the moment, so this publication will have to be updated once we revise our own climate standard. So I will not go through the contents of the comparison in detail, as we did that already at the last meeting, but very happy to take any questions from the GSSB or any feedback or comments on this work. And we're also happy to collect comments after the meeting in writing if GSSB members would like to have a little bit more time to go through the conference in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lara. Are there any observations or questions from the GSSB members? Of course, we did see this last time. No. Okay. Thank you very much, Lara, and we'll move on to the next item, please. Gillian, next slide. Thank you. So Bastian is going to start off on this item on the guidance to identify risks and opportunities that arise from impacts, which we've seen was an issue raised by investor respondents on the mining sector standard.
Thank you, Carol. And Joe, we can move to the next slide already. So the paper that the staff has prepared on this matter is to raise awareness with the GSSB, but also start a discussion on the matter of the link between the guidance that we provide on identifying the most significant impacts and more generally developing an understanding how business practice, the business model, business activities result in impacts on others. And linking this exercise, this body of work, the knowledge that is derived from it with the expectations that exist in corporate reporting, in many regulations, but now also specifically for sustainability matters as part of the offering of the ISSB, to disclose risks and opportunities that arise from sustainability matters. And we believe that through the regulatory advances, in particular on the EU level, where you have a double materiality approach, more and more organizations look to GRI to connect the practice that we have been developing for very many years and that we have provided increasingly detailed levels of guidance for the identification of impacts with the expectations that companies are confronted with to publicly disclose the risks and opportunities. And the risks and opportunities are a wide set of things to be disclosed. Specifically, what we are discussing here are the ones that arise from the impacts, because there is the link between what a reporting organization does as part of the GRI reporting and applying GRI 3, and they can use this process, and they can use the learnings, the findings from this process to inform their understanding of risks and opportunities arising from impacts. I think it is also a consequence of the coverage that GRI has accomplished in terms of number of companies, that stakeholders actually look first and foremost to GRI to provide that guidance. And we're in a slightly different situation from the colleagues at the ISSB who've stood up in an entirely new framework and new guidance on this particular subject matter. We are also in a different situation from the colleagues, for example, at EFRAG, but also in other regulatory efforts that are now coming up with specific expectations that pertain to jurisdictions. Because with us, we have an existing user base, and one of the main questions that they are asking themselves right now vis-a-vis all these other developments is how can they make good use of what they're used to, what they have developed already in-house, and how can GI reporting be a stepping stone towards fulfilling all these other expectations that are put on them in context of corporate reporting. I think it is important to note that from a GRI and the GSSB perspective, Carol and we as staff have been very clear in the conversations with the ISSB that our strong preference would be to issue joint guidance. If we are to stand up a global system for corporate reporting in which GI provides the guidance for impact reporting, the colleagues at the ISSB provide the guidance on risk and opportunity disclosure, then arguably, it should be the role of us collectively to provide the guidance to the market. Having said that, there are limits to the capacity and ability of the ASB right now to commit to such a project in the near term. That doesn't take away the need for this guidance that is articulated to us in the public domain, and we feel that while we want to continue to seek out every opportunity to collaborate with the ISB, we want to proceed with creating guidance and making that part of our work program for the coming year. We move to the next slide. What is essential here to say is that this guidance would start with the GIS3 process and help reporters to then make the link into risk and opportunity disclosure. And we see this guidance connecting to those that are faced with financial materiality obligations in relation to sustainability matters, for those that actually have a double materiality requirement right now that pertains primarily to companies in the EU, but we expect that more regulators will move in that direction. And we want the guidance to be connecting to these different developments, so it has to be standard agnostic at this point in time. But again, I just want to emphasize that point. It is still the intention to, wherever possible, collaborate, in particular with the colleagues at the IFRS. And we will continue this discussion in the background. But for now, for our resource planning, for the coming year, it is key that we have the discussion about what guidance would entail and how we support such a process, both in terms of its nature in relation to the due process, requirements that we have around stakeholder engagement, and so on. So if you go to the next slide, please, Jim. I don't see the slides moving. Yeah. So we see two possibilities here. The due process protocol allows us to issue guidance that is non-authoritative in status, does not form part of the set of standards, is an addition to. This application guidance is probably what comes closest to it in more general terms. We also have the possibility to issue authoritative guidance, which would look to, well, the development process would have to live up to the due process expectations. And it would also become part of the set of expectations for in accordance reporting. From a standards division perspective, we are recommending to start the process of developing non-authoritative guidance by avoiding strict adherence to all elements of the due process protocol. At this stage, we can actually hit the ground running and build on existing contents and start to inventorize what is available, and maybe also close the gap in terms of the expectation gap in terms of what stakeholders would like to see from GRI and what we can stand up as part of our due process proceedings in a timely fashion. That said, we don't believe that this precludes us from, at a later stage, moving into a process where we issue authoritative guidance. What we're also not saying is that non-authoritative guidance would basically forgo all the virtues of the due process, in the sense we would still believe that stakeholder engagement is absolutely key, that we need to form a group of experts around us that have either already created contents in that space or opinionated and knowledgeable about the subject matter to help us along, right? because while we have a strong rooting in the guidance that we provide on impact identification, we can arguably say that it is not a core skill set of GRI to look at the financial risk and opportunity side of things. So we need to bridge that gap through involving the right stakeholders. And this is where we come back to collaboration, also with regulatory parties like the colleagues at EFRAG and elsewhere, but importantly other stakeholders. So our proposal here is to start with a project, look at it as non-authoritative guidance to start with, make crystal clear from the beginning that this is a collaborative effort, ideally with parties both on the global as well as on the jurisdictional and regulatory level, but also the other stakeholder groups, and then see how this develops, how quickly we can get into a space that we have credible guidance available that we can issue to the market, and decide while we're doing this whether there will be a juncture where we port this over into a formal standard setting process and eventually issuing authoritative guidance. I think I leave it at that in terms of commentary, looking at Laura whether I made any major omission there, and otherwise handing back to Carol, who wanted to also provide her perspective on the discussions that we've had thus far.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bastian. We've already discussed at the GSSB the amendment to Box 1 of GRI 1. We've talked about the importance of impacts in identifying risks and opportunities for the organisation. The fact that impacts accumulate over time, and that the cumulative impacts of many organisations over time also present risks and opportunities for organisations, and at the same time affect dependencies for organisations, which bring risks and opportunities as well. You know, it's often said by some, and I've heard ISSB members say that GRI standards are for stakeholders. We are for a number of key constituencies. Investors are one of them and have been one of them. We have discussed at the GSSB that this impact information is key for stakeholders and the starting point for going on to identifying other important matters. So whether we think of it in terms of impact material or financial materiality, you know, I see it more of a process, starting with the impact as the baseline and moving along to then identify the risks and opportunities. We have in GRI 2.22 a requirement to you know, disclose the relevance of sustainable development to the organization's strategy. And that requires thinking about, you know, how those risks and opportunities affect the business model of the organization and the you know, the mix of products and services if they're going to adapt to make a more positive contribution to sustainable development. So what's proposed here is also a bridge between the GRI 3 process and this disclosures on strategy within the GRI standards. The conversations that Bastian and I and others have been having with standard setters and regulators and you know, big consultancies, you know, really sort of emphasize the importance of this process to us, and increasing the relevance of the information to a broad range of stakeholders. And when I say stakeholders, we mean investors as well. So I'll leave it at that for now, because we're very keen to hear your views on this. I see Joseph first, and then Jeff. Joseph.
Yeah, thank you, Bastian. Thank you, Carol. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I think it's a very, important development, I believe, and this will be, quite strategic for corporates as well as investors. Um, Maybe it's an implementation issue, but I thought I'll raise it because most of the corporates are following an enterprise risk management process at this point of time, which is mostly aligned to the COSO framework. So when we develop this guidance, if we consider that COSO framework and align it with, then it will be a minimum effort from the reporter side. My limited point.
Thank you, Joseph. Jeff, and then Chalendra.
Great. Thanks, Carol. Thanks, Bastian. Just a quick comment of support. I think it's an important project, and as I was going through the document, I had a feeling. I was like thinking that non-authoritative guidance would be the right place to start, and then when I saw the recommendations there from the standards division, I totally agree. So just a quick comment of support there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff, and Chalendra.
Hi, Bastian. Hi, Carol. So, I mean, something I was just thinking about in the past as well was how we bring in can GRI. I think Bastian just mentioned it might be authoritative or non-authoritative. That's a different path. But how can GRI provide some kind of guidance in addition to the 4 steps it provides for impact analysis or impact materiality? Can we, for example, provide some kind of input towards identifying the risks and opportunities, maybe in steps 5, 6, 7, 8, for example? And just to touch on what Joseph mentioned in terms of the enterprise risk management, I feel that there is a bit of a gap between impacts and financial risks and opportunities, because there is an element of enterprise risks which actually sits in the middle. So I'm thinking that impacts will first result in enterprise risks and opportunities, and then from there onwards there will be some degree of subset which would be the financial risks and opportunities. Something we use here in Sri Lanka, Bastian and Carol, just thought out here since Joseph brought up the COSO framework. We also use the AA1000 standard of the UK, which talks about the 6-part materiality test, which includes direct financial impacts, regulatory authority, stakeholder engagement, peer review, and basically 6 parts of that, which highlights risks and opportunities. The last part I just wanted to mention was, while that would probably be aligned with GRI 3-1 in terms of a process, GRI 3-2 could then technically be the disclosure of the impacts, the risk management, the enterprise risks, and then thereafter the financial risks. The point I just wanted to bring, and I was building up towards this, was this would then need to, I feel, culminate with GRI 3-3 also being a guidance given to 3-3, where we look at the risks, governance, strategy, and metrics part of the DMA, so that it aligns with the IFRS standards or TCFD or the ESRS. Because if you look at all of them, they use those 4 elements of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics. Just on the metrics team, what I was thinking also was, is there some degree of possibility where under metrics we state that the GRI topic standard should be disclosed, of course, but we also open it out where we become framework agnostic, like what Bastian mentioned, to allow GRI reporters to also use any other framework metrics to further disclose or further complement the disclosures with regard to risk and opportunities. So thereby making GRI almost like an umbrella framework where other frameworks can just simply fit in like building blocks into that.
Thank you very much, Chalendra. Very interesting. Anybody else like to come in on this, Galia?
Yeah, just wanted to comment that in our organization currently we have fight with financial department because sustainability experts, they admire the GRI and the GRI materiality standards and requirements. However, the financial people who have never been dealing with the GRI standard because it was done by a sustainability professional, influenced by the big four, some of the big four, they would like to change in order to adapt to the double materiality of the CSRD. So we are having fight, and this that will be prepared will really help a lot to organizations that for long time are reporting based on the GRI and would like to continue with the GRI. Because there, how to explain you that financial people, they don't understand the essence of impact materiality. They don't understand. And even if we try to explain, they're a bit scared from the CSRD because it will come in a year and a half, and they would like quickly to adapt something that Big Four is providing to them, instead of continue something that is really great as the GRI.
Yeah, that's true. And I can say as an accountant, having observed that they tend to understand once something bad has happened and impacts have resulted in the risks actually being realized for the organization. So yes, that is a good point. Thank you very much, Galia. And that is also what we're hearing, that this is very important, and it will help to increase uptake of impact reporting, because organizations will directly see very clearly how the impacts lead to risks and opportunities that are relevant to strategy. Thank you. Chalendra?
Carol, just something to add on to what Galia mentioned was that I think there needs to be some kind of voicing out of the real definition of what sustainable development is, and it comes from the meeting of the present generations without compromising the future generations to meet their own needs. So we're talking about generations, we're talking about needs of those generations, and it's not there. And by the definition itself, you can't ring fence it or narrow it down to financial risks and opportunities. So I think it's important that we create that distinction between sustainability disclosures and sustainability related financial disclosures. It's important that it doesn't mean that you can simply go into financial risk, sustainability related financial disclosures without disclosing your sustainability disclosures as well.
Yes, I think we're all agreed on that, because we have now discussed this a number of times, including when we were looking at the GRI 1 Box 1 amendment. So I think that's clear. So what we're talking about then, what we seem to be of the view to do, is to extend the guidance in GRI 3 and add extra steps to get to the risks and opportunities, and consider also the cumulative impacts of organizations over time and the effect they have on dependencies. You know, I'd certainly be very keen to see that that non-authoritative guidance become very quickly authoritative guidance and part of our standards offerings. Are there any other comments? Bastian, did you want to come back?
Yeah, I think one thing that the board can help us with is, if you have recommendations for individuals or institutions that we should be connecting to understand where there are pockets of contents that have been created on this subject matter, that is usually how we want to start a project like this. And it will go a long way in ensuring credibility of the outcome. So if you have ideas, and again, it can be an individual, it doesn't need to be an institution, it can be a piece of research or public-facing document that is available, please send it through to Laura and me. And we will continue the quest to actually form an opinion how we best run this. I think the next update will then be in October from us, where we have a bit more time to discuss how we go about rolling this out.
Yeah, many thanks. Yes, and we do have some thoughts already of people who can help us. people that we've been talking to, and also some sort of consulting guidance on how to do this, and how to identify the risks and opportunities from the impacts. So we'll leave that one there. Thank you all very much for a good discussion on that issue. That was very much appreciated, hearing all your input and views. And I think that takes us to the end of the public session of this meeting. Thank you, and we'll move on to the private.